Welcome, everyone. It's really great to see you all. We're going to start with short introductions, and then we'll go into the land acknowledgement. I just want to say it's really nice to see everyone's face. I'm really happy to be here to talk about this topic and have a conversation. My name is Emilio Ulloa, professor of psychology, and I serve the campus as the Associate Chief Diversity Officer for HSI Regional Affairs. I use the pronouns he, him. And if you ask me what my preferred ethnic identity is, I will answer that I am a Chicano. And I would like to allow Dr. Lara to introduce himself as well.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I am excited to dive into this dialogue, really exploring more about the conversation, the evolution of the terminology, and at the same time also how is this all found within our Latin American diaspora. And so, as Dr. Emilio Ulloa mentioned, my name is Dr. Renzo Lara. I oversee the Latinx Resource Center here on campus. I use he, him pronouns. And if you ask me in terms of how I identify myself within Latinidad, right? I would probably say first that I'm Mexican American, then Latino, and then I would throw something else out there for me because of the fronterizo or transport identity. And so to throw more stuff into the mix. And we'll go more into that as to what is all those terms mean. And some of you might have already a notion what it is, and some of you might have more defined definitions. Again, this is more of exploration, more of a dialogue, and really more of us kind of having a community conversation about what it looks like for these terms. One of the things we want to acknowledge is always that we stand upon Kumeyaay land, right? In terms of SDSU, where it's seated in terms of our community. They've been here millennia. One of the things that we always try to do is go beyond land acknowledgement. That is from the top down, right? Yes, the Kumeyaay people have longstanding traditions, longstanding customs and heritage. And our goal is really to, yes, let's honor our community that is here in terms of the indigenous land, but at the same time, really infuse all our efforts from the top down to ensure that we are honoring the community, also at the students here at campus. And again, because they are the legacy of Red and Black, and it is the land of the Kumeyaay.
Great. Thank you, Renzo, Dr. Lara. What we want to do here today is make sure that we frame the conversation around what we're really hoping to do, and what we're hoping that we can talk about here today. And so I want to share with you that our main goal is to generate dialogue and awareness centered on terminology utilized within the community, the Latinidad, as we will a term that we'll use a little bit continuously throughout here, as well as the complexity of this beautifully diverse community. We have some specific objectives for our time together today. We're hoping that we can really just practice having a discussion about identities and terminologies, but through this particular lens of Latinidad, Hispanic and Latinx. We are also hoping that we can share some information with you so that you become more familiar with the origins and the meanings of a lot of these different ethnic labels. And largely speaking, through this dialogue, we hope that we all get a little bit better at identifying when it's appropriate to use collective labels and when we should really just ask people how they identify themselves in context. A couple of other disclaimers, and Dr. Lara, you can jump in at any time, but I do want to make it clear that neither Dr. Lara or myself are ethnic studies experts or historians, but rather what we wanted to do here today was share a perspective that is largely informed by our own practice in higher education, our own reading and education, our own personal experience, and largely through our interactions with students. And so you'll see that we're going to bring largely a student lens to this conversation as well, because that's where our bread and butter exists. That's a part of our identity and where we really learn about and practice having these conversations. As well, I want to say that our goal today, our intent is not to have a solution to the label term dilemma. So our goal is not to tell you this is what the answer is. As you'll see throughout the conversation, there is no answer and it's not appropriate. But we will help we'll help each other kind of have a conversation about why that is the case. We want to create a dialogue in this process here. And Dr. Lara and I both want to make sure that you understand that that in our practice, both at work with students and in our lives, we have a deep respect for the choices that individuals make about how they identify themselves. That's going to become important a little bit later as we talk about evolution of terms and the identity development theory as well. But I want to make sure we said that at the beginning. One more thing. We will have a Q&A at the end. We will have a couple of breaks so that we can get some information from you. So largely, we hope that you can, to the extent possible, hold a lot of your questions until the end. We want to make sure we stay on time and we get through some of just the basics of the material that we want to cover. Anything else, Dr. Lara, before we do the values?
Yeah, no, I echo everything what Dr. Emilio Ulloa mentioned. This is a quote that I put in there because ultimately is the strength of our community is what really makes us a true essence of who we are, right? I think the ongoing dialogue is what is always value in the process, right? In terms of how do we get to labels, how do we get to identities if we use those identifiers. So I put this quote in there by Rigoberta Menchú. She's a Guatemalan indigenous human rights activist, because that really speaks to what we're trying to do. It's ultimately the process, the dialogue that comes together as a community. And again, it's not solution based oriented. It's more of, again, exploring these terms and what they mean overall, and then also individually.
Yeah. And then lastly, I know I said earlier that we are not ethnic studies experts, but I am a psychologist by training. And one of the things I know, I was a social psychologist, is that we are all social animals and that we come to the table with a need to belong. One of the evidence-based, research-based, robust findings about the way to assure that we can strengthen our sense of belonging is through values affirmations. So I'm going to do a little quick values affirmation with you all today. I'd just like you to reflect on your core personal values for a second here. And in the chat, just share which of your core values brings you to this particular workshop here today. So it doesn't have to be anything extensive. And if you want a stem to work from, you can just use something like, I'm here because I value fill in the blank. So just take a second to reflect on your core values and then answer in the chat before we get going. Those are great.
Yes. Learning about myself, community, inclusion, representation, Latina, Chicana, mother Latinx, Chicanx children, awareness. Yes.
Yes, fantastic. And I love that you are affirming one another in your answers with those emoticons. That's fantastic as well.
Yeah.
Okay. So why don't we get into some of this here? One of the things that I think is actually beautifully ironic when it comes to the struggle that people have with figuring out what to call us or what we should call ourselves is actually ironically that this is a beautifully diverse community that we're referring to, right? And we are not one thing. Latinidad is not a monolith. So let's kind of talk about what that means and what people refer to when it comes to that. Hispanic is not a race, right? It's an ethnicity. And if you are Hispanic or Latino or anything and you've done a census, you realize really quickly that that choice is not on there typically when you're filling out a survey. We are multicultural, multiracial, multilingual. There are different races that belong to the group of Latinidad, including indigenous, Black, white, mixed, etc. We have lots of different skin tones and physical phenotype features. We have backgrounds from over 30 different countries, although, and we have a slide to show this later, in the United States, Mexicans make up a very large proportion of our Latinidad. We have a diversity of language, including regional Spanish accents and dialects. Some of us speak Portuguese. Some of us are bilingual. Some of us try really hard. We have some indigenous languages as well. Even in the US, the generational statuses are very different, right? We have immigration, second, third, fourth generation. Some families that are native to the US Southwest. In fact, you know, you may have heard the term the border. We didn't cross the border, but the border crossed us. We have varied levels of acculturation and as well enculturation. We are politically diverse. Many lean left, but there are definitely very right-leaning and conservative members of our community. It's important to note that some Latinx are undocumented, but not all undocumented are Latinx. And we have intersectional identities. Dr. Lara?
Yes. So as you can see that we are multicultural binational, right? And oftentimes give the example, if you look at Latin America, right, in terms of over 30 countries, it goes all the way up to Mexico. But if you also include migration and immigration patterns, you can also see the Spanish South of the Southwest border regions. And right now, if you look at where immigration as and immigration patterns, they're in Midwest. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago, I went to Alaska and I stopped at a port, and I the first thing I saw at this port was tacos from Tijuana, and I said, "What? If we're making all the way to Alaska, I mean that you can really encompass the entire Western Hemisphere, right? In terms of where our Latinidad is." And I often say, yes, our origins are traced to regions, but at the same time, the community is really where I trace Latinidad or more of a culture and custom. So if you look at that, it's a huge region to cover, and within that, right, there's definitely intersectional identities, not just within Latin America, also from other parts of the world. One of the things that I've seen over and over in orientations as I'm meeting with parents or I'm out there at tabling is that we have a lot of students who are different mixed ethnicities, right? So this summer we were paired up with the APITA Center, and a lot of times are the parents and or the students would come up to us, and we would kind of do our pitch, right? And it's like, this is great because I identify as Salvadorian and then also Filipinx, or I identify as Chinese and then Mexican. So we kind of did a joint pitch at that, impromptu, right, in terms of where they're coming in. So I'm saying it's so diverse. And so I'm gonna throw this at you in terms of ceviche. Who has had ceviche before? You can raise your hand and virtually. So if you like seafood, I understand. You can also throw this analogy with salsa, right? But I'm going to quote our faculty scholar, Dr. Villarreal, who said it beautifully, right? He said, some people that make ceviche with octopus or fish or shrimp. Some people do vegan. Some people use different types of ingredients. If you Latin America, there's Peruvian ceviche, there's Costa Rican ceviche, there's Mexico. So the goal is ultimately to make a seafood dish, but it all comes together it's a different flavor, but ultimately at the same time belongs to a certain category. And you can do the same thing with salsa, right? You can throw in chiles, you can put habanero peppers, all that. Ultimately, the ultimate goal is to have salsa, but how you get there, that's really that's the journey, that's the process. So when Dr. Villarreal said that, he said it to our USEM students at first year. Our students just like got it like so quickly. So I said, you know what, this is perfect as we're doing this workshop. Yes. So
yeah. And I think, Dr. Lara, you make it a point as part of the LRC and just in your work to talk about Afro-Latinidad and
right.
queerness as well, right?
Yes, thank you for reminding me. Yes, so we also mentioned those intersections, right, of Afro-Latinidad. We have a program called Heterogeneous Sin Fronteras, which really looks at the intersections of Latinidad, specifically with queer LGBTQ plus communities in that intersection. So our goal is really to try to address as many of these topics and conversations at the LRC, knowing that we're not necessarily able to touch everything, but at least we're able to acknowledge it in some way, whether it be our social media, whether it be through our images. So actually, this is actually a sticker that our students created for Latinx Heritage Month, and we really try to include different features, different aspects of our community, from Afro-Latinidad to the flags and everything. So again, we can go on and on intersectionality, but again, I think the ultimate point we're trying to drive is that we're not a monolith, and it is ultimately up to the individual how they identify. And oftentimes when I do these workshops or these conversation pieces, I think people have more questions than answers, and that's okay. You know, again, our goal is never to come up to a solution.
Yeah, and just for some visuals here, as we mentioned, Latinos, there are 55 million in the US. We make up 17% of the entire population. That's 1 in every 6 people. I trust the infographic. I didn't do the math in my head. But it is also 1 in every 4 children. So that gives you a sense for the pipeline, right? And as we mentioned before, although there is a diverse a community in the U.S., a large proportion of them are in fact and have Mexican backgrounds here, right? The largest bar on that track, and I think that's kind of it's interesting also. But I will warn you to please, if you know anyone who is Dominican or Puerto Rican, do not call them Mexican, please. That's just rude and uninformed. Dr. Lara is going to share with us a little bit about the timeline of these terms so you can think about their origin. One of the things that we want you to pay attention to as we walk through this is that we're going to really highlight 2 things about ethnic identity terms. One is the evolution of these terms. And historically, you will kind of see how these terms evolve from one to the other based on issues that have come up, based on things that people have identified as constraints or problems. And later on, we'll talk about not only the evolution, but identity development and how they are developmental as well to make it even more complex. Dr. Lara?
Yeah, so as you can see, there's a lot of wording in here, and I'm not going to go through each and every single thing on here, but as mentioned, the terms that we use have a long history that oftentimes was other groups have been imposed on our community. And as we see the evolution of the term, it's been more of a reclaiming, more of an empowerment process of trying to take back what really, how do we identify? And so if you look at the actual term of Hispanic, right, you can trace it all the way up to ancient Rome. And again, I'm not a historian, it's from a lived experience. And so this is more of what we see and what we do programs on. And when we see the colonization efforts or colonization, integration of Spanish and all of Latin America, we see that Spanish became a conquering language. And then we start seeing this term Hispano or Hispanic to Hispania back in the 19th century. And so that's where we start to see the evolution. And I'm making a big jump. There's a lot that happened, but in efforts of time, we start seeing the integration of Hispanic as an ethnic identifier during the U.S. Census in the 1970s. And how it was defined during that time is anybody from Spanish-speaking background, which excludes Portuguese and speaking individuals. So again, this is one of the things where we start to see the specific identifiers from the government standpoint.
Also, not only does it exclude Portuguese speaking individuals, but it includes those from Spain, which in and of itself became a problem.
Yes. Then we start seeing also, as I mentioned, the reclaiming process, empowerment through civil rights movement. The Chicano movement in the 1960s really started this sense of empowerment from the Mexican American standpoint of our culture, going back to the roots of Nahua with indigenous connotations to it. Chicano used to be a term that was used in the early 20th century in 1911 to be something that was negative towards Mexican Americans. And so in the 1960s, it was a reclamation process because it was tied to indigenous roots of the language, not what tied to the sense of empowerment. And this is where it came through in terms of the name, and it's stuck to this day, right? Latino, we start seeing this as a pan-ethnic term. It really starts now looking at more cultural traditions. And then we also have more and more of what's happening in federal government with the integration of HSI, which is the Hispanic-Serving Institution, federal guidelines, and the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities, who really, there's a national organization that's done in today, who really start to use that term. And then we get to the Latinx in the 2000s, where we see really these trying to be inclusive and includes non-binary, gender neutral, identifying individuals, as well folks who are the LGBTQI community. We saw the integration or the inclusion of the term in the Webster's Dictionary in 2018. There's a lot of conversation. You see there's a lot of debate in regards to this term. We're not here to engage in debate because, again, we embrace all these terms at the Latinx Resource Center, but it gives you a sense of history of where everything comes from. But in the adding of the X, there was a lot of pushback in terms of the community because of the Spanish language, right? In terms of not being grammatically correct. There's also this aspects of, Spanish has this gender-based terms for masculine and feminine. So there was a development of Latine, which is, again, they use interchangeably Latinx and Latine. That's why you see it in our promotions of gender neutral inclusive term, but it's meant more to fit in with the Spanish dialogues and dialects. One thing I do want to say is, if you see this conversation and you see this all the time, and people are really, really passionate about this term, so much that I've tabled in different events and they see my tag and it says Latinx Resource Center, and then they ask me, why is it not Hispanic? And so, well, I said, you tell me. I mean, let's have a conversation. And then at the end of the day, again, I'm not there to prove anybody wrong or right. I just listen. But I do want to say that if you look at the evolution and history of the term, Hispanic has been around for centuries. And if you look at also the development of Latino, Latin America, it's also been around for the last century or so. So those are the terms that we see more and more, what people identify in terms of a general umbrella. However, Latinx and Latine were emerged as a sense of inclusion in terms of really including all these marginalized groups within the Latin American diaspora. And, we're going to continue to see this evolution. And so one of the things that I really enjoy about this is just the beauty of our culture, or how rich our community is in terms of this term. So you'll see that more and more folks are continuing to engage in this conversation, dialogue, sometimes discussions, because of how rooted, how long this term has been rooted in our history with the federal guidelines or identifiers.
Yeah, and so to carry the point home, one of the things that I hope you're kind of getting from this is too, the origins here help us understand why people choose the different things that they've chosen, right? This tells you kind of where these came into favor and why they came into favor each time. As a community, we started to incorporate different terms, but each time there was a new term, there were always trailers. People have different reasons for hanging on to the terms that they feel that they are most comfortable with. Even in both of our introductions, Dr. Lara and I have different ways of describing ourselves, even though we do have a lot in common in terms of our background and our upbringing. And so I think that's one of the things that's important. And also it means that there are no assumptions you can make about people, even if you know a lot of things about their background, about which of these terms they are comfortable with. And so in context, in speaking to individuals, we advocate for always asking people, I think the better way is, what preferred ethnic identity do you like to use? And that sounds a little awkward. We just say, how do you identify is another sort of simpler way of doing that. And then usually you'll get really great stories about where that comes from. And then you can always ask follow-up questions as well.
Mhm. So this is just a Venn diagram. Nobody had a question? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have a question just because as someone who often has to refer to the community rather than individuals, I get that if I'm talking to an individual asking them like their preference, but do you have suggestions for how to refer to the community as a whole?
So context matters, right? I will say this disclaimer that even though context matters, what we've discovered in our work is that oftentimes you will have to, even though you're paying attention to context and what your goal is and you know your audience, that there will almost always be someone that does not agree with the way that you have characterized their community. It's just been our experience in the last 10 years so far. Having said that, though, if you have the luxury of space and letters and time, one of the approaches that we like to take is to include some of the major ones. So we often will say Hispanic, Latinx, Latine, Chicana, Chicano, or Chicanx. And that way we're trying to send a message that we're trying to capture this entire community, and we're hoping we don't leave any of you out, because we know some of you identify with some of these terms as opposed to others. When you don't have that luxury, Dr. Lara, we've talked about this, depending on the context, again, when we're trying to capture an entire group, we both personally lean toward the gender inclusive terms. So Latinx or Latine, I think that we are, we have style guides that have sort of told us Latinx is appropriate in higher education, but I think we're evolving beyond that because it's very easy to use Latine, and it's very easy to start to change our common use of that. But Dr. Lara, would you have something to add to that as well?
Yeah, I agree, and it's oftentimes where even when I'm saying it in a general sense, right? Because we do speeches and we do presentations, I said if I didn't include that, apologies. And then I'm just gonna make a disclaimer, but again, it's gonna continue to evolve. And so for us, yes, that's how what I tend to do, try to include the major general identifiers, just trying to include as many individuals as I can. It's not a straightforward answer.
Yeah.
But I think it's okay because again, it talks about the evolution and how the richness of our culture and how people identify, right? And it's again looking at our landmass in terms of even with the people. I mean, you can categorize the whole Western Hemisphere, and then that's hard to do in like 3 or 4 words.
Yeah. Colloquially, sometimes within our group, we refer to ourselves as raza, which is kind of easy. I don't know if it'll catch on. I really love to see that. But it's one of those choices that I think you really have to understand your audience and the context to know if that's appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so this is just more of a visual, and I won't go much into it, but it gives you a sense of where the differences and also some of the overlapping countries or the languages. Again, this is more generic, and then we're gonna go more into the specific identities in a little bit, but this is more an overview as to where when we look at identifiers, when we look at census, this is what it is starting to talk about in regions and what Latino versus Hispanic and what they mean. Oftentimes, I say the Latino Hispanic at times people like to use that interchangeably in terms of what they're talking about. But again, what Dr. Ulloa mentioned is like it's all about context. If you're talking about people who speak Spanish versus those who don't, you might want to look at in terms of the terminology. I would probably say somebody who's Latino, because it includes French, Portuguese, and so on, versus somebody perhaps who's looking at Spain and Spanish origins.
So this actually gets to the complexity as well. Earlier in the beginning, we gave you what our preferred ethnic identity is, what we answer if someone asks us, how do you identify? But you can see in terms of the complexity, we also feel an affinity to a lot of these terms as well. And so if you were to ask me, are you Hispanic? Well, depending on the context, I would say, well, yeah. Like, what is it the government asking? And we're talking about grants? Then yes, I'm Hispanic. If we're talking about, are you a Latino? Yes, I identify as Latino and I'm male. So yeah, the O works for me, right? Or do you belong to the community that's referred to as Latine? Well, yeah, I belong to that community because that umbrella covers my personality as well. So I think that's one of the things that we wanted to really call to your attention is the question can be different. Do you identify with this group or versus what is your preferred identity?
Right. So, in a sense of trying to keep you all awake and your pop quiz, I'm gonna put the link in here to ask you a couple questions based on what we discussed. And I think I can share, right? Let me share my screen. So the question is, and we went over some of this, right? Name a country that's considered Hispanic, but not Latin American. All right, let's see what we got. Spain? Usually, yes. I mean, it's not in Latin America, sure. Anything else you want to add, Dr. Ulloa?
You only had the one response?
No, yet. No, so this is a word cloud. It's based
got you.
Yeah,
okay.
So based on the
Dr. Lara, Dr. Lara started with an easy one. Let's try a harder one.
Yeah. The next one is name a country that is Latin American but does not speak Spanish. And we did talk a little bit about this. Okay. Brazil, yeah. French Guinea, Martin, Belize. Yeah, that's good. People pay attention. That's good. All right, one more, and then we'll get back to the presentation. All right, so name a Latin American country with significant Black population, and we didn't necessarily go into this, but as I mentioned, there is a growing and still a large contingent of individuals who identify as Afro-Latino, who have ancestry or roots back to Black populations or Black communities. Right. Locked. What we got? Cuba, Colombia, Dominican, Brazil, Kenya, Belize, Dominican. Yeah. Yes, those are a lot of those that we see, but we also see Mexico. There's a large population in Mexico, not only just recently, but it's been for generations from the revolution. We have folks who have been leaders and so on. So there is a large contingent of Afro-Latinos, some from Veracruz, some from all the way down to different parts of the coast.
Yeah, it's really important. We wanted to throw that one out there as well. I mean, it didn't show up in the word cloud, and part of the reason is it's not what we tend to think of, but also politically, Mexico has only recently sort of recognized the extent that they have this Afro-Mexicano population and started even recording officially in their census within the last decade.
Mm-hmm. So this is where we go more and more into individual, right? So we started with broad terminology. We talked about history and the timeline, but in terms of how we identify, this goes back to the beginning where Dr. Ulloa mentioned how I identify. I talk about how I identify, and what we see and the research would tell us is that more and more individuals identify with a family country of origin or region. So I started off with saying that I am Mexican American. I was born in San Diego, but then I lived for most of my childhood in Tijuana, and I have that transborder fronterizo experience. And so that's why I also say this is part of my culture and my identity. It's very unique in terms of the border culture, customs, traditions. That is not necessarily something we see throughout Mexico. So we see that a lot. And then I also went on into talk about by nationally, right, in terms of dual language. I embrace a lot of what we see in the United States with food. For me, if you look at traditional food, hamburgers, hot dogs, pizza, I embrace that. But I also get down like pupusas, on ceviche, tacos, all that. And so that kind of talks about the diversity and also at the same time the richness of our culture. And when we talk about regions, we also see it within parts of the United States. So if any of you are from Texas, there's a lot of things. There's a lot of population, so Tejanos, right? And we see that there's a lot of cultural pride with Texas as far as being an independent nation before it was part of the United States. And within that, we already had generations of mostly Mexican-based communities, and that's why it's Tejanos, Californios. And so we start seeing the originality, right? Somebody said Chula exactly. That's where I also, that was my second home, right? Chula Vista is where I also grew up as a teenager and early adult life. And Emilio, I think you mentioned also mentions about the culture of New Mexico in regards to language and so on. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit.
No, just to sort of drive the point home that these regional differences are significant and cultural. And as an example, people from whose ancestry goes back to settling the New Mexico area for a long time refer to themselves as Hispanos. Even when much of the rest of the Southwest was rejecting the term Hispanic, they have a reason and a heritage that tied them to that term as well.
Yeah. And as we mentioned, oftentimes it's up to the individual how they identify. If you come to the Latinx Resource Center, we welcome everybody, and we say we don't say this how you need to identify. It's however they decide, and we'll talk a little bit about identity development and so on. But it's also important to note, I know we're moving into the other one, that there's about 10% of the indigenous population reside in Latin America. I didn't include, I should include more from the U.S. indigenous populations. However, the indigenous population, a large amount of the individuals don't embrace the term Latino, Hispanic, because it is something that it was imposed by colonization, imposed by individuals who gave labels. And again, part of the reclamation process and part of empowerment is to go back to your roots. And if you look at the indigenous populations, there's over 500 languages and dialects that are non-Spanish speaking. And then if you look at the cultures within that, there's over 800 cultures. So when we talk about Latinidad and Latin America, and that's where I also started with that quote from indigenous Guatemalan and human rights activists, is a lot of individuals, and I put a video on there and we can share the slides later, in terms of they don't embrace that term because it doesn't really trace back to the indigenous roots. So when we talk about Latinos and Latinas in Latin America, please note that a lot of indigenous groups did not embrace that term.
Very much so. We talked about how these terms are how they evolve. They have an evolutionary nature to them. As practitioners in higher education who work with young adults, and as a psychologist, I think it's also important to note that there are developmental considerations that we have to think about when it comes to how students identify. Just share a couple of short things with you. I identify as Chicano. Now, I'm not first generation college going. My dad went to UC Riverside, and he went in the late 60s. So he was part of that Chicano movement. So as I was growing up, I heard these terms a lot, but I still identified as Mexican until I went to college and I started learning about what the term was. I started learning about more of those movements, and I started learning about what that entails when you make that choice. And that's when I made the choice to start identifying as a Chicano. And I have ever since then. but it's just important to know that these ethnic development theories are characterized by different stages of understanding of one's own experience, one's own identity, that are typically organized around crises or times of change that inspire them to evolve how they themselves identify. Some of which have to do with just sort of just maturity, but also some of them are intersect with the way that they interact with the world and their experiences with racism, discrimination, and institutionalized discrimination as well. So when we think about our students, it's really important to kind of think about it in that sense. We do survey our students at the Office of HSI Affairs oftentimes to find out different things about how they're doing, about how their experience is going, and to help us understand how we can really steward their experience here well. We often ask them how they identify, and and this is important because in our work, you're probably thinking, I want to know how, what's important, what can I use when I'm talking to my students? And let me tell you, I get 15 to 20 different answers when I survey a group of at least 100 people. And it speaks to not only the diversity, but the developmental phases that they're in and what they identify as being the most salient part of their own identity. Is it geographically based? They might say, I'm Mexican. Have they taken courses in Chicano studies? They may say, I'm Chicano or Chicanx. Are they very attuned to social justice around LGBTQIA issues? They may use the X or the E. And all of those things are part of their own personal experience that they will choose. Yeah.
Yeah, and just adding that to that, the Latino critical race theory is another one that drives that home, where it is really looking at systems, putting out things like the U.S. Census and how governments have put labels on it. And so this is more of that critical analysis. And ultimately what it goes into is about more community-based rather than what the general consensus says about who we are. So give you some sense of where some of this theory is rooted in terms of the identity development aspects, and also the critical analysis of our community in terms of reclamation and empowerment of our terms.
So Dr. Lara, do we go with the poll, or do you want to open up for questions?
Let's open up to questions. But I do want to say, go back. This is also another sticker. I'm just shameless plug. Pachanga, it's the end of our Heritage Month programming. It happened in 2 weeks. Also a sticker that was made by our student, trying to capture the diversity of our community. It's happening October 2019 at the Aztec Student Union Courtyard 5 to 9. Shameless plug.
Everyone's invited.
Everybody's invited.